I wasn't particularly surprised by the result. The campaign had been very hard fought. I'd taken part in the Remain campaign when I had a bit of time, but also followed it for my work and looked at the arguments the Leave campaign was developing, how well they were doing in debates, how well they were doing in polls, and what kind of answers I was getting on the street. And I got the impression that the Leave campaign's arguments were working better, and that they were really getting through to people who weren't always that interested in politics, but had felt that they really needed to make a decision in this debate. Leave was attracting those people much more than Remain was. Obviously, 1 week before the vote, there was the tragic assassination of Joe Cox, which both campaigns dealt with, I think, honorably, and stopped campaigning over the weekend. But there was a feeling outside the campaigns, especially among investor communities who didn't want to see Brexit, that this would change things. And it did change the polls. Leave lost a bit of ground, but then they ultimately won. And everyone talks about the polls getting it completely wrong just because of what happened in the final week, but in fact a lot of polls had shown that Leave were ahead. And so I wasn't particularly surprised, no. How did I feel about the result? Initially very confused, because I actually discovered the results slowly, like all the people who stayed up all night. I was at a counting centre, and in Camden the result was quite clearly for Remain. But there was a TV in a room where you could go and see, and very quickly, actually, over about an hour, it became clear that Leave was ahead and probably wasn't going to be caught up. There was some personal sadness, but I had to go to work. I had to do, I had to write some analysis with my boss on what this meant. And as I worked on this analysis, I just felt very perplexed, because anyone who'd followed the campaign knew that there wasn't much of a plan, and the government of the day, so under Mr. Cameron, actually made a point of saying that it wasn't planning for this outcome. Now, you always know that there's some contingency planning for the first days after the result, trying to calm the markets, and all of that was done quite well. But I knew, and I was convinced, that really the country did not know what to do next. We knew we wanted to leave the European Union. We didn't know how. We didn't know exactly with what deal and in what time frame. And so that worried me, beyond any kind of personal sadness, because my side had left. I felt quite worried. And I also felt worried because very quickly after the result, it became clear that the result for Leave had unleashed quite a lot of hate crime in the country. Now, I wouldn't say for 1 second that the Leave campaign encouraged this, or that most people who voted Leave were behind this, but I do think a small section of Britons felt that this justified carrying out violence against particular communities, or just enabled them to go out into streets and to claim that they wanted to send people home. And that was quite worrying as well. I don't think the result changed how I felt about the UK in terms of whether I like it or not. I still like living here. I'm not planning to go anywhere else in Europe where I've lived previously just because I don't agree with the result. That's not at all the case. And I don't really agree with people who've said, oh, I'm leaving the country, I don't like it anymore. I think that's a bit silly. It has changed something I feel about whether the UK can stay together, though. I've studied what Brexit means for Scotland, for Northern Ireland, and I think people in London are just not aware of the very different political culture that has developed, especially in Scotland, the very different feelings people have about who they are in the world, whether they want to be part of the European Union, part of international bodies such as the European Union. And I fear that despite the fact that support for independence in Scotland, for instance, has not really gone up since Brexit, I think in the long term it will, enough to make a second independence referendum inevitable. And I'm not Scottish, I wouldn't be able to decide, but I wouldn't like to see Scotland leave the Union. I wouldn't be able to stop them from doing so if they wanted to. It would be their decision. But that makes me somewhat sad. My opinion on the High Court's ruling forcing the government to put the triggering of Article 50 before Parliament before it does so is that it has made Brexit even more interesting. I don't have an opinion on the legal case. I can't judge the two sides of it. It does seem reasonable to me that because we don't know whether Article 50 is reversible or not, and when we do leave the European Union, some of the rights we as Britons have enjoyed within the European Union as EU citizens, so to speak, will go. It does seem reasonable that Parliament should have a say on that before this potentially irreversible process begins. Is there a word to describe how I feel about Brexit? I think it's skeptical, and I hope it's healthy skepticism, because there are so many options available that I'd like to think that I am listening to what the government is suggesting, listening to what various experts, though much maligned, are suggesting, and trying to think for myself that perhaps there are options available, etc. The problem is that I think there are some very, very difficult dilemmas that weren't necessarily presented to the electorate during the campaign, and that these dilemmas, i.e. between preferential access to the single market and control of immigration, will be discovered in a less pleasant way. Either because we wait so long that investment into the country falls, the pound falls further, prices go up, people lose their jobs, and then it is explained to them that actually if you want all of it to get better, you have to forego the controls on migration that you voted for. That won't be particularly pleasant. Or because the government says we're pursuing this line, it's going to get better, and we're going to stop immigration, and the economy continues to do very badly. And I don't think we can really escape that dilemma. Now, the government says that it isn't a binary choice, that membership of the customs union isn't a binary decision, but that's nonsense. And so I think that I can only be skeptical about the next 2 years. There are silver linings. There are things that this government can do well, that this country does very well, but they're the silver lining part of it. My overall feeling about Brexit is one of skepticism.